So Devlin, we know you've been working with the four-quadrant model for a while now, and we're really curious if you could comment on anything that's caught your eye or how you've found working with it.
Well, I can say several things about that. The model itself is so useful for me because it provides vantage points from multiple perspectives about each client or patient. I see that allows me to get a more differentiated and clearer picture of patients presenting symptoms or presenting problem, and grounds it in a theory that that makes sense with experiences. I really like being able to stay close to the experience of the patient and close to my experience with the patient.
In the room, as
In the room,
yeah.
right in the room.
Mm-hmm.
It's also helpful because the model helps to capture a very complex situation, complex gestalt of the patient, and so you don't get lost in the details, and you have checks and balances, different points of entry, quadrant 1, quadrant 3, for instance.
So how does the model help you not get lost in the details? That's interesting.
The model provides, each quadrant is an entree,
Mm-hmm.
And because there are, because they're different entrees, that's a good question, but I know that's how it works for me.
Yeah.
It keeps a holistic picture. It keeps a balanced. It provides a balanced way to not get fixated, for instance, totally on the symptom picture, or it's a map for negotiating my experience with the patient.
And does it, as you sort of experience that, the holistic picture, does it make you more anxious or less anxious?
Oh, less anxious. That's a very helpful question, because I think it fills in the blanks of the holistic picture of the patient, and it's a checkpoint. If I'm stuck, I know I need to look at what quadrant, for instance, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
using,
Mm-hmm.
and it helps to. It's a template that you can use each session you're with the patient, and to kind of zoom out and see where you are with the patient, and to even track changes
Over time.
over time.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, at some different points, we've called the four-quadrant model a process grid.
Yes.
Is that what you
Yes,
take
very
on
much
that?
so. That's one of, I think, I appreciate the experience near focus
Mm-hmm.
and the process focus.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're using it with process in mind, it does again offer you a tracking,
Mm-hmm.
a way to track
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
what's happening. For instance, taking a symptom
Mm-hmm.
and filtering it from the standpoint of quadrant 1, and what beliefs about the patient could be generating or somewhat generating a symptom.
Mm-hmm. Mhm.
or depression or.
Mhm. Well, when we were creating the 4-quadrant model, I know one of the things that that used to happen to me when I was earlier in my career was to be sitting with the patient and wondering what I was missing at any given
Mhm.
moment. And do you find that the 4-quadrant model helps you check in about what you might be missing more clearly?
Yes, as you're even in the session,
Mhm.
I think, again, using it as a reference point to observe what's happening in the room, and especially where there are stuck places.
Mhm.
But very definitely
Mhm. Mhm.
sheds light on what you're missing.
Mhm. Yeah, and I find too, when I am dealing with a client who may have really intense affect, and I imagine people who are, beginning their careers may be getting a little rattled by seeing intense affect in the room, if you can pull back and say, well, I wonder what might be stimulating this from quadrant 1 or quadrant 3,
Right.
and was there some disappointment in quadrant 3, and if it's there, looking to the relationship in the room as a possibility, which leads you into thinking about transference differently.
Right.
And I know we talked about that a lot.
Yeah, we've talked about that a lot. When there's intense affect, and it can kind of paralyze you, so to react to it and get immobilized. But it may help to be able to ask a question of ourselves. Amidst this intense affect, what am I not seeing?
Mm-hmm.
What am I not hearing?
Yeah,
Is a
that
way
too.
kind of balance out.
Right, you have that as a check, again, a checkpoint.
A grid checkpoint. And that could, might help the person to be less immobilized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I remember when I was working with you, Patricia, and working with a person who had a repetitive pattern of self-defeating behaviors, and the click, the aha, when I was able to use quadrant 3 in terms of loyalty, that what was perpetuating it was a loyalty to his father.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say some? You want to say some more about the loyalty issue?
He, I think what was revealed, and we've subsequently done a lot of work around
Yeah,
that,
I know.
was that he was encouraged by a very, very religious family to stay within a very confining religious environment.
Mhm.
And he his father had been very disappointed when he left the faith. And so part of the compromise he's made is he can leave the faith, but he can't succeed. He has to remain somewhat loyal to his father, to fulfilling the father's predictions that you're not going to make it without God, or you're not going to make it without the faith. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so his failure was a way of maintaining loyalty
Loyalty
to the father.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of maintain loyalty to the father, and although he's ostensibly breaking away and has broken away,
Right.
but then he retains this
Yes.
connection to a dissociative
Yes.
loyalty that he's not aware of.
Yes.
And so the other part of that I remember that we've been working on too is to tease apart the defensively driven loyalty contract from his desire to break away, and some of his goals and dreams were coming from that place of authenticity,
Right.
the authentic self. And so part of what we can do is mirror that back
Mhm.
But we have to get to the loyalty
Have to get to
dilemma
that because
first.
he can't really relinquish his tie or his
Because consciously he knew he wanted to break away and
Right.
he had goals
Right.
and aspirations. What was mysterious was Vaughn
Exactly,
shooting himself in
mysterious
the
is-
foot.
That's right.
And it is a bit mysterious because, there's authentic loyalty, non-compulsive, excuse me, non-compulsive loyalty. And what we're talking about, the compulsively driven loyalty, which, and then it becomes a little more difficult to think about or even to talk about, and to be able to get at that, the disassociated
Right.
loyalty. But I was interested in your experience of it, and was it difficult to try to access the loyalty issue with him?
No, once I got it,
Huh.
it wasn't. I remember the moment it just kind of clicked into place, and so the next session, I was listening for it, of course, in context, but
And I remember you showed me a video of it, and just to see sort of the dawning on his face and a smile
yeah,
So,
that
Yeah.
he got
He
on
got
his
it.
face. It was almost like a smile of relief.
yeah, yeah. So it's
And that's part of the power of the language of the model too. I mean, people look at it first and they say, well, why is quadrant 3 being loyal waiting?
right. I had a hard time at first trying to
Yeah.
grab that, but it is.
But it is the relational quadrant.
It is the relational
Yeah.
quadrant. That's absolutely right.
And so-
But the fact that he sort of smiled and it's a sign of relief, showed some relief.
Well, he got it. Yeah.
God, I think it indicates that you've prepared him for that. I mean, you've been working with the other quadrants.
Right.
It didn't just happen by itself. The language you used and the ways in which it's possible to telegraph thoughts and ideas, seemingly disconnected
Mhm.
to anything else, but very, very much relevant to loyalty.
Mhm.
It seems enough of that, and then at some point when you do broach it, you might hear relief
Yeah,
rather
it's-
than dismay.
So you have the model in your mind, and I guess I understand the telegraphing, that knowing the model allows you to, based on what you've gathered in your experience with the person, to put something out that might not feel connected to his situation.
Yes.
But it sets the ground or the
Mhm.
paving the way for some insight.
Yes.
Yeah, and we often test the waters that way.
Right.
I mean, sometimes it's going down, a dead-end street, but
Mhm.
oftentimes not.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
it's a matter of testing.
But one of the other things I really have come to appreciate and be much more mindful about are entry points.
Mhm.
And not big ones, but the subtle ones. Maybe the way a patient gestures with his hands, or makes a comment about, uses a particular word
Mhm.
that is a thread. If I pick up on it, and follow it, it really does take you
Mhm.
to
So
significant places.
So you're attending to that, and you're just tracking it,
Mm-hmm.
sort of
Listening.
moment up to moment.
Yeah, it is a way of listening.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
It is a way of listening, and which is a very good antidote to people therapists who say, I don't know, I feel as if I'm not saying enough, I'm not doing the right kind of work. Whereas if you follow this thing through as you're doing, you are working.
You are working,
You are-
but you're not. You're being you're being present and tracking, and that
Mhm.
organically leads
Mhm.
to the next step.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's not an intellectual. It has an intellectual component, but it's not totally intellectual.
Right.
And it's trusting the client and trusting the unfolding
And
process.
you've said that a million times. Trust the process.
Mhm. But the way we learn to trust the process is by listening more deeply,
Right.
hearing those entry points,
Right.
learning how to track them. I mean, simply by repeating their word
Mm-hmm.
or
Mhm.
wondering what it means,
Mhm.
and then it
Mhm.
just, you find that it goes deeper.
It goes deeper.
And do you find that you slow yourself down that way too?
Yes, I'm not, I need all the help in that department, and so it is a, staying, grounded in the present, using all your senses,
Yes.
and using, all your curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
and moment to moment, the words that are used, the music that accompanies the words, all of those are entry points.
Mm-hmm.
Right, the music that accompanies the words, they are entry points. And the entry points, we're quite busy as therapists, we just don't know how busy we are.
Well,
When we realize that what being, the depth of how busy we are in terms of tracking and following things through, both compromised parts of the patient's life and the healthy parts.
And the healthy. The other thing I really like is the focus on authenticity and the,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they telegraph in various ways
yes.
elements of health, and we can see it sometimes even in the very symptom that they're describing it, but the way they're describing it has a component of health to it, which is nice to be able to identify, because we can then support that.
Mhm. And the notion of character solutions,
Mm-hmm.
which makes, sort of takes the taint of psychopathology away, if you see it as an effort at adaptation, a failed effort, but usually having some protective
Mm-hmm.
function, and just feeling that in myself toward the patient
Yeah.
helps the sense of safety on the patient's experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then to be able to work with defenses, for instance, helping the patient understand that this is here because you needed it to be here. This
Mhm.
was, you're trying to take care of yourself.
Trying to take
It
care
really
of,
reduces the resistance.
trying to take care of yourself, and while you're even in the very symptom, it's a we can sort of identify that the person is beginning to accept the fact that his health is something that nobody can take away from him, and it's always going to be present in whatever he's talking about. It's up to us as a therapist to be able to palpate that health and keep it, to the extent we can, keep it going and reinforce it. Eventually, hopefully to the point where the patient can reinforce it
Mhm.
for himself or herself.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's where I think the idea of character solution as opposed to character disorder or
Yes,
character
yes,
pathology,
yes.
and it's more mutable, it's
It is,
changing.
right.
It changes as we're engaged in the therapeutic process
Yes.
over time. And I don't know about,
It's a humane way to see
it feels much more compassionate.
Oh, it is very much.
Much less judgmental.
And in that way, again, I think, set up a deeper sense of safety.
Mm-hmm.
Compassionate, safety, and also it actually yields a more optimistic outcome, because
Without
we're that close to a solution, pseudo solution, or whatever you want to call it. We're that close to it, where this person has, the patient has given his or her best efforts and best
Yes.
assets in terms of developing this.
Mhm.
So it was kind of a work of art
Yes, yes.
and of passion, and so it's idealized and therefore, you know, affects the person's mental health,
Mhm.
because there's always an element of contempt attached to the idealization. But on the other hand, it frequently involves the best assets that the person has.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So in that way, it lifts up the authenticity, the true authenticity of the real self.
Of the real
Mhm.
self, you see it, it's in all these different aspects of the real self. Yeah.
Mhm.
We don't need to create real self; it's already there.
It's already there.
It just needs to
Yes.
be realized.
Mhm. But, you know, also the way you're talking about it, Jack, it helps us understand quadrant 4, I think, in a more useful way, a less frightening way. If the best assets are being used in quadrant 1 in an overdetermined way, when the patient gets disappointed and you see the activation of quadrant 4, either against the self or against others, if you keep in mind these are the patient's best assets,
Yes.
it gives us a window in to
Mhm.
talk and be curious about the nature of the harshness
Mhm.
without taking away something that's vitally important to the patient in quadrant 1.
That balance is so important for
Yeah.
the therapist because
Yeah,
it registers with the patient
Right.
senses it.
Right.
yeah. And I know that in your patient, when we finally got to the loyalty piece, there was some time that you really had to spend looking at that quadrant 1, quadrant 4
yes.
dynamic.
Yes.
And really how
Because he turned against himself.
rigidly overdetermined his
Vehemently.
standards were,
Yes.
and then how
How it was
Quickly
it's a
he-
setup for the right.
he turned against himself with a vengeance.
Right.
So just having some language around that and bringing curiosity and conscious awareness to
Mhm.
that was, you know, her entree in to begin talking about quadrant 3 and loyalty.
What you've done with that balance is protected the person from excessive humiliation and shame.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
And
Yes.
That's right.
they register this.
Yes.
This is a deep kind of thing. It may not even be spoken as such, but they know when you've spirit
Yes.
than that. And
That's right, that's so important.
Yes.
yeah,
So important. So we're always holding and working with shame,
yeah.
whether we articulate it or not. And the model is
Shame,
designed
yes.
to work around it before we touch into
Mhm.
shame more
Mhm.
directly.
Mhm.
But it's palpable, it's a felt sense that they have from us because clients know non-verbally when somebody's seeing the bigger picture.
Sure.
Yeah.
They sense that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good, well, good, that's
Mhm.
very helpful.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's also, I don't know the word, but it's holographic in that you can just keep going and going and going. I mean,
The idea.
I think it just
Yeah.
allows for, the more you use it and the more you understand it, it just keeps revealing deeper and deeper levels.
And that just is an entree into our understanding of the model and using the model around particle analysis.
Mhm.
That we see parts of
That's
the
right.
whole and they become more integrated and we go deeper and there's,
Right.
you know, so the whole
Everything
reveals other
changes, right, it
parts.
changes.
And further parts and,
Mhm,
yeah.
mhm. Yeah, that's why it could be never ending, really.
Mhm.
And the whole process is never ending.
It's never ending,
Yeah.
you're right,
It's a process.
you're right.
Can you say more about the circularity of the model in part whole?
Excuse me. The circularity of part whole and the fact that it's a never-ending process is because it's not linear. It doesn't go from A to B to C to
Right.
D. It's constantly feeding back on itself,
Mhm.
and it's we may not know whether the parts we have identified as parts, we think there are parts, really are part, but we'll find out soon enough. They're either demonstrated or not, and then the more the parts identify themselves, the more we start seeing the whole. At first, the whole is the character pathology part of it, the pseudo solution. That's the whole, which is important to be able to put together. It may take some time actually to be able to identify what that is. But this is the hidden part of the picture. And then later on, the gestalt and the whole involves the emerging authenticity of the patient, quote, real self.
Right.
That this is a emerging whole now, and it's we are seeing parts of it, parts of that emerging whole in different glimmerings of health as we can see them, and all this is much more easily tolerated by a patient and creates less resistance. There still is, but a lot less.
A lot less.
A lot less.
Right.
And I think when you're working with particle analysis on the more subtle levels, it allows you to see, sort of the micro dissociations that patients make in any given moment more clearly.
Right.
Can you say more about that?
Well, when you're tracking phenomenologically about a statement and then another statement that maybe represent a split, you can also start paying attention to what happens in the room affectively, like when you lose them or they stare off into space and then come back. And simply by tracking the parts to the whole or tracking the splits, you can observe dissociative process in any given moment.
I see.
And the coming back.
Right, and coming back.
And then over time with the trust, begin to gently comment on that, what just happened
What
there.
just happened, right.
Which begins to raise something eventually into the patient's awareness.
Right, that was tacit, that wasn't
Yes.
known.
That's as close as we can get to the actual experience of the patient. The micro, what word did you use to identify it as such? A micro,
You see the
Splits.
affective
the
rupture or just
Uh-huh.
dissociating.
dissociating, micro dissociations.
That's right, that's what you said.
Micro dissociations, from moment to moment dissociations,
Mhm.
which is not something that we've, that's sort of, we read much about in the literature. I mean, moment to moment dissociations,
But
but
they happen
dissociation is happening all the time.
all the time.
Either on a small scale or a grand scale.
But I think it's very helpful to really understand that dissociation happens all the time, that it's happening all the time. And that's another thing that the book.
And just to see those many ruptures occur, which is, I think just the whole shift to, and I think the field is shifting in this direction, to be focusing more in the present moment. Listening, entry points, tracking.
Right.
It just allows you to observe sort of the micro disappearances because of some nerve that got hit.
Yeah. And we discover the past through discovering the present, so to speak.
Yes.
Exactly.
Rather
Yes,
than
yes,
the other way
vice
around.
versa.
The other way around.
Yes, yes.
Yes, that is how it happens organically.
Yeah.
And that relates as much to using the transference,
Yeah.
in terms of discovering the past through the present in the room, in the transference.
The transference is we use the term palpating. If you think that the patient is not, or the client is not yet ready for sort of even any kind of talk about transference, it's too frightening to them to talk about what's happening in the room. you can palpate the transference just by saying things seemingly disconnected again, such as, what's it feel like talking here?
Yes, yes.
Which seems like a kind of a normal kind of thing to ask, not any kind of fancy transferential interpretation.
Right.
But it is a way of
about the
palpating the
transfer, right.
transference, which then allows it the next time to be a bit easier.
Yes.
Mhm. Or if they're talking about something in the derivative in the outside world, to just innocently say, have you ever had that experience in
In
here?
here.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
Mhm.